The dark was absolute. For Jacob Winters, it had been absolute for 29 years. His fingers traced the edge of the worn kitchen table, finding the familiar notch where he'd dropped a soldering iron in '43, a habit from when he could still see, mapping his world through touch. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who once rewired 177 Sherman tanks under artillery fire now needed his daughter to sort his socks by texture. The smell of coffee hung in the air, strong and bitter. Sarah had made it the way he liked, black as engine oil. Another habit from the war, when you took your comforts however they came. Jacob could hear the gentle tap of her fingernails against the ceramic mug, a nervous rhythm that told him more than her words ever could. "Tell me again about the tanks, Dad." Sarah's voice came from across the table. She'd heard the story dozens of times, but tomorrow she would present his case to the Veterans Recognition Committee. One last chance to acknowledge what he'd done, what it had cost. Jacob's unseeing eyes didn't move, fixed on some invisible point past the kitchen wall. The smell of burnt metal and diesel suddenly vivid in his mind, as if the 29 years since Bastogne had collapsed into nothing. His hands, still strong, still precise despite the years, clenched involuntarily, remembering the bite of frozen metal against raw skin, the desperate race against time as artillery shells whistled overhead. "It wasn't just the tanks, Sarah. It was the men inside them." He paused, swallowing hard. 5 men to a Sherman. Commander, gunner, loader, driver, co-driver. Young men with pictures of their girls tucked into their helmets. Boys barely old enough to shave, who'd never see another Christmas if those tanks didn't keep moving. How does someone become the reason 200 men keep breathing and end up alone in the dark? The answer begins not with heroism, but with a rule-book violation that should have gotten Jacob Winters court-martialed before he ever reached the front. The Army had strict protocols about electrical systems on the M4 Sherman tanks. The manual was explicit. 500 pages of precise specifications, redundancies, and safety measures. Field modifications were expressly forbidden. Every electrical engineer in the 7th Armored Division had that beaten into them during training. Tampering with the electrical system of a 30-ton war machine carrying 4,000 rounds of ammunition and 500 gallons of high-octane fuel was asking to create a rolling funeral pyre. The Sherman's vulnerability was already legendary among the troops. They called them Ronson lighters, after the popular cigarette lighter brand whose slogan promised, "It lights first time, every time." German tank crews called them Tommy cookers. A single well-placed shot from a German 88mm gun could turn a Sherman into an inferno. The last thing anyone should do was compromise the electrical system that controlled everything from the engine starter to the turret rotation mechanisms. Jacob knew all this. He had graduated top of his class at the Army's Electrical Engineering School at Fort Belvoir. He understood the Sherman's complex electrical system better than most of the men who had designed it. That's what made his modifications so dangerous and so effective. He wasn't guessing. He was calculating risks with precision, trading safety margins for combat readiness with a slide rule's cold logic. And yet, by December 1944, Jacob had already modified the electrical systems on 11 Shermans, against every regulation in the book. Word had spread quietly among tank commanders. If your systems were failing in the cold, if your radio kept cutting out, if your turret rotation was sluggish, find the skinny kid from Pennsylvania. Don't tell the brass, don't file a report. The steel beasts were dying in the Belgian winter. Not from German guns, but from the cold that crept into their wiring, that froze condensation on connection points, that contracted metal and cracked insulation. The Sherman had been designed in the deserts of Aberdeen Proving Ground, tested in the moderate climate of Fort Knox. No one had fully accounted for what would happen when these machines encountered the wettest, coldest winter the Ardennes had seen in 30 years. The official doctrine stated clearly, tanks with electrical malfunctions must be sent back to established repair depots, no exceptions. The waiting period was 48 to 72 hours minimum, an eternity when German panzer divisions were cutting through the Ardennes forests like a hot knife through butter. What Jacob did violated every safety protocol. But it also kept tanks in the fight when they were desperately needed, and not a single one of his modified Shermans had failed, yet. Colonel James Harwick, commander of the 7th Armored's Maintenance Battalion, discovered Jacob's unauthorized modifications during a routine inspection in early December. Instead of immediately relieving him of duty, Harwick pulled him aside. "I should have you on the next transport back to a court-martial," he said, voice low enough that the other mechanics couldn't hear. "But I've seen the performance reports on the units you've worked on." Jacob had stood at attention, eyes forward, waiting for the hammer to fall. "Your modifications have increased operational readiness by 37%. Tanks you've worked on are reporting 20% less downtime." Harwick paused. "Officially, I never saw this. Unofficially, be careful, specialist. The minute one of these modifications gets someone killed, we both go down." It was a gamble, a calculated risk that ran counter to every engineering principle Jacob had been taught. The bitter cold of the Belgian winter was playing havoc with the Sherman's electrical systems. Factory standard wiring wasn't holding up, but Jacob's customized relay boxes were. Sergeant Michael Foster, a tank commander with the 40th Tank Battalion, later recalled, "The brass told us it would take 3 days to fix our electrical system. 3 days! We didn't have 3 hours before the Germans would overrun our position. Then someone mentioned this electrical specialist who could get us running in 40 minutes. We didn't ask questions. We just wanted our tank back in the fight." The smell filled Jacob's workshop. Part garage, part shed, part battlefield improvisation. Burning insulation, solder flux, the sharp tang of electrical components pushed beyond their limits. His fingers moved with practiced precision, rewiring junction boxes, reinforcing circuits, bypassing safety redundancies that were failing in the extreme cold. "I knew it was against regulations," Foster continued. "We all did. But regulations weren't stopping Panzers. Winters's modifications were keeping our tanks in the fight, and that's all that mattered to us." By mid-December, Jacob had modified 34 Shermans. Not one had failed in combat. Tank crews were requesting him specifically, willing to drive miles out of their way to have him work on their electrical systems before heading to the front. Then came December 16th, 1944, the beginning of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge.
Die German Offensive caught die Allied Forces komplett by surprise. 3 German Armeen, über 200.000 Mann, näherlich 1.000 Tanks, smashed in die amerikanischen Leinen in den Ardennen. Das Wetter war perfekt für die Germans. Heavy fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow und Eis hampered Movement und Kommunikationen. Auf dem Morgen von Dezember 17, Jakob war werkeln an einem faltigen Radiosystem, wenn die ersten Reports kamen ein. German Armor war brechend durch everywhere. Amerikanische Units waren scattered, cut off, surrounded. Die 7. Armors Division wird being rushed zu Bastogne, eine kritische Rotjunktion. If Bastogne fell, der German advance wäre unstoppbar. Major David Reynolds burst into den workshop, his face pale beneath a layer of grime. "Winters, we need every tank mobile, now!" "Sir, I've got 4 in the shop with electrical issues." "You've got 2 hours. After that, we roll with whatever's running." 2 hours.
Standard procedure said each tank would require at least a full day of work. Jacob looked at the 4 Shermans, their hatches open, engine compartments exposed. In the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. Jacob turned to his assistant, Private First Class Tony Morelli. "Get me every spool of copper wire you can find. Strip it down to gauge 8 if you have to." "What are you thinking?" Morelli asked, already moving to the supply crates. "I'm thinking we're going to break every rule in the book." The modification Jacob devised was beyond unorthodox. It was, by engineering standards, insane. He designed a parallel backup electrical system that bypassed all standard safeties, running direct lines to essential functions: turret rotation, gun elevation, starter motor, radio. If the main electrical system failed, the tank commander could switch to Jacob's backup with a single lever. In normal circumstances, such a modification would never be attempted. The risk of fire, of electrical shock to the crew, of catastrophic system failure was enormous, but these weren't normal circumstances. Lieutenant Paul Weber, who commanded one of the Shermans Jacob worked on that day, remembered, "He told us flat out, This might burn out your entire electrical system in 24 hours. It might start a fire, but it will keep you moving, keep your gun firing, and keep your radio working until then. Jacob worked without breaks, without food. His fingers became raw from stripping wires, from working in the freezing cold. His eyes burned from staring at tiny electrical components for hours without rest. But by the deadline, all 4 tanks were operational. I knew what I was doing was dangerous, Jacob would later tell military investigators. But every tank we could keep in the fight meant another chance to stop the German advance. It meant American lives saved. The 4 tanks rolled out with Jacob's modifications. Within 12 hours, word came back they were performing flawlessly in conditions that had disabled other Shermans. Major Reynolds immediately ordered Jacob to apply his modifications to every tank that came through with electrical issues. For the next 72 hours, Jacob barely slept. Tank after tank arrived with systems compromised by cold, by battle damage, by the limitations of their original design. Each time, Jacob applied his unorthodox solution. Each time, the tanks returned to combat. Captain Richard Miller, operations officer for the 40th Tank Battalion, sent an urgent message on December 20th. Send Winters forward. Too many tanks disabled in field. Cannot wait for transport back to repair depot. It was against protocol to send a maintenance specialist to the front lines. But nothing about this situation followed protocol. Jacob gathered his tools, his spools of wire, his soldering equipment. I need a jeep and a driver, he told Morelli. And every electrical component you can pack. The roads to Bastogne were chaos. Retreating infantry, advancing reinforcements, ambulances loaded with wounded, all fighting the snow, the ice, and the constant threat of German artillery and aircraft. The driver, a corporal named Davis, navigated the confusion with grim determination. "They say we're surrounded," he shouted over the engine's roar. "Germans on all sides." "Just get me to the tanks," Jacob replied, clutching his toolkit. The smell of cordite hung in the air, mixing with the exhaust fumes and the sharp coldness of winter. They found the first disabled Sherman 2 miles from Bastogne proper. Its electrical system had failed completely. No starter, no turret function, no radio. The crew huddled nearby, watching helplessly as other tanks continued toward the front. Jacob went to work immediately, not bothering with formalities. The tank commander, a lieutenant named Harris, watched skeptically. "Division says we need a full repair depot for this." "Division isn't here," Jacob replied, already removing access panels. "I can have you running in 40 minutes. If you can get my tank moving in under an hour, I'll recommend you for the Silver Star myself." Jacob didn't respond. His world had narrowed to wires and circuits, to the puzzle of making this 30-ton steel beast move again with parts never designed for what he was attempting. True to his word, 38 minutes later, the Sherman's engine roared to life. Lieutenant Harris couldn't believe it. "How long will this hold?" "Long enough to make a difference," Jacob told him. "Just don't get hit." Harris managed a grim laugh. "I'll do my best." By nightfall, Jacob had repaired 7 tanks near the perimeter of Bastogne. Word spread quickly among the armored units. A miracle worker was at the front, bringing dead Shermans back to life. Tank commanders were radioing their coordinates, begging for Jacob to reach them before they were overrun. Colonel Harwick, who had tacitly allowed Jacob's modifications back at the repair depot, received reports of his specialist working near the front lines. He immediately sent orders. "Return Winters to depot immediately. Too valuable to risk at forward positions." The message never reached Jacob, or perhaps, as some later suggested, it was deliberately withheld by officers who recognized the value of having him where the tanks were failing. On the morning of December 21st, Jacob was directed to a collection point where 11 Shermans sat immobilized, their electrical systems frozen or damaged. German artillery had zeroed in on the position. Shells fell intermittently, sending sprays of snow and earth into the air. "We can't stay here long," Davis warned, ducking instinctively as another shell landed 300 yards away. "This whole area's under observation." Jacob nodded, already assessing which tanks could be brought back quickest. "We work fast. Start with the ones that need the least." For 6 hours, through sporadic shelling, Jacob moved from tank to tank. His fingers were numb, his eyes strained to the point of searing pain. But one by one, the Shermans came back to life. 8 of the 11 were operational by mid-afternoon, a feat that should have been impossible. The cold was merciless, metal so frigid it burned to touch. Each breath crystallized instantly, forming ice crystals in Jacob's thinning beard. His hands, once protected by gloves, were now bare, the delicate work requiring a touch sensitivity that no glove could provide. The skin cracked and split, blood occasionally smearing across the contacts and wiring. He would wipe it clean with a rag, ignoring the pain, and continue. Inside each disabled Sherman, the cramped confines amplified every sensation. The lingering odors of sweat and fear from the crews, the metallic tang of gun oil and cordite, the faint smell of ration tins and cigarette smoke permanently embedded in the steel. With each repair, Jacob became intimately familiar with the unique personality of each tank, how this one's generator whined at a higher pitch, how that one's turret motor caught for a half second before engaging. They weren't just machines to him, they were lifelines, each one representing 5 souls who would either return to their families or die in these frozen fields. "How the hell are you doing this?" a tank commander asked him, watching in disbelief as his previously dead Sherman roared back to life. Division engineers said this was depot-level repair. Jacob didn't look up, already packing his tools to move to the next tank. Division engineers have the luxury of following protocol. You don't. The commander grabbed his shoulder, forcing Jacob to meet his eyes. "My crew owes you their lives." "Name's Captain Ellis, Baker Company. I won't forget this." Jacob nodded once, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just keep moving. Don't let the electrical system idle too long in this cold." As he moved to the next tank, a shell landed closer than the others, maybe 200 yards away. Jacob instinctively dropped to one knee, his body remembering the training that his mind was too focused to recall. Shrapnel whizzed overhead, pinging off the armor of the recently repaired Sherman. A reminder of the constant danger, of the razor's edge they all walked. Major Reynolds arrived as Jacob was finishing the 8th tank. "Winters, you're a goddamn miracle worker. Those tanks you fixed yesterday helped hold the line on the western approach. Without them, we might have lost that sector." Jacob didn't look up from his work. 3 more here I might be able to save. "No time. We've got reports of 20 more disabled along the northern perimeter." That's where the Germans are concentrating their attack. 20 more, each one representing 5 American soldiers who were either sitting useless in a dead tank or had abandoned their armor to fight on foot. 20 tanks, 100 men whose lives might hang on Jacob's ability to bypass safety systems and jury-rig solutions that would make his engineering professors recoil in horror. "Get me there," Jacob said simply. The northern perimeter was barely holding. German infantry and armor were pressing hard, probing for weaknesses. The disabled Shermans were scattered across a 2-mile stretch, some within sight of enemy positions. Captain Samuel Wright, who commanded a company of the immobilized tanks, described the situation. "We had Panthers less than 800 yards away, and our tanks couldn't move, couldn't rotate their turrets. Infantry was doing their best to protect us, but it was only a matter of time before the Germans realized our situation and overran us." As night fell, the temperature dropped well below freezing. Jacob worked by flashlight, its beam carefully shielded to avoid drawing enemy fire. His modifications grew more desperate, more improvised. He was no longer just bypassing safety systems, he was creating entirely new electrical pathways never envisioned by the Sherman's designers. Private James Collins, a loader on one of the tanks, recalled watching Jacob work. His hands were bleeding, actually bleeding from working with the frozen metal and sharp edges, but he never stopped, never complained, just kept bringing those tanks back one by one. By midnight, Jacob had restored 12 of the Shermans. The tank commanders were ordered to pull back to more defensible positions, to redistribute themselves along weaker sections of the perimeter. As they withdrew, they provided covering fire for Jacob as he continued working on the remaining tanks. The 13th tank presented a unique problem. Artillery damage had destroyed critical components that Jacob couldn't replace. The tank commander, a sergeant named Mitchell, was prepared to abandon the vehicle. Wait, Jacob said, an idea forming. I need parts from another disabled tank. Mitchell shook his head. Nearest one's half a mile away, almost in German lines now. Take me there. It was reckless, possibly suicidal, but Mitchell recognized the value of saving another Sherman. He gathered 3 of his crew, all armed with rifles and submachine guns. We'll give you 5 minutes when we get there, not a second more. The disabled tank lay in a shallow depression, partially concealed by pine trees. German infantry had advanced past it, apparently considering it no threat. Working feverishly, Jacob stripped the parts he needed: junction boxes, relay switches, lengths of insulated wire. They were nearly back to their own lines when a German patrol spotted them. The night erupted in gunfire. Mitchell and his men returned fire, covering Jacob as he clutched the precious electronic components. "Run!" Mitchell shouted, emptying his Thompson submachine gun toward the muzzle flashes. Jacob ran, the cold air burning his lungs. A bullet snapped past his ear. Another kicked up snow at his feet. But he made it back, the salvaged parts intact. With those components, he completed the modification on the 13th tank, and then, without rest, moved on to the 14th. Dawn of December 22nd found Jacob still working, having restored 17 tanks to operational status. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements mechanical, but he continued, driven by the knowledge that each tank he repaired might save American lives.
Der Attacke der Morgen war der heavieste yet. Artillerie poundete die amerikanischen Positionen. Panzer IV und Panther advanced behinter Infanterie, siegend zu brechen durch zu Bastogne. Jacob war werken an dem 19. Tank, wenn der Artilleriebarrage intensifizierte. Captain Wright ordered everyone to take cover, but Jacob refused to stop. Almost done, he shouted über die Explosionen. 5 more minutes. Wright later testified, I ordered him twice to take cover. He pretended not to hear me. Just kept working mit shells landing within 100 yards. Der 19. Sherman kam zu Leb. Das elektrische System reagierte auf Jacobs unorthodoxe Modifikationen. Als der Crew climbed an Bord, Captain Wright physisch pullte Jacob away from dem 20. Tank. Das ist enough, wir zu exposed hier. Die reparierten Tanks waren bereits in gegangen, die German Armor. Der 75 mm Guns feuerte stetig auf die avancierenden Panther.
The sound was deafening, a physical force that pressed against Jacob's eardrums until they felt ready to burst. The acrid smell of propellant hung thick in the air, mixing with the diesel fumes and the metallic scent of fresh snow. Through gaps in the tree line, Jacob could see the muzzle flashes of German tanks, the tracers cutting bright arcs through the early morning gloom. He had given them a fighting chance. 19 Shermans that should have been dead weight were now contributing to the defense, their guns adding crucial firepower to the thinly stretched line. He could feel the vibration of their engines through the frozen ground, a reassuring tremor that meant American armor was still in the fight. But the 20th tank sat silent, its crew watching Jacob with desperate hope in their eyes. 5 more men who might not make it home if their 30-ton lifeline remained dead in the snow. Jacob pulled against Wright's grip. "One more," he insisted, voice raw from hours of shouting over the din of battle. "I can get one more running." Wright's face was a mask of frustration and fear. "You'll get yourself killed. That's an order, specialist." For the first time in his life, Jacob considered directly disobeying a superior officer. The calculation ran through his mind with the same precision he applied to his electrical modifications. 1 more tank, 5 more lives, a simple equation with a clear answer. He wrenched free of Wright's grip, diving toward the 20th Sherman. He heard Wright curse, heard him shout something that was swallowed by the thunder of artillery. Jacob focused only on the task ahead, fingers already reaching for his tools, mind-mapping the sequence of modifications needed to bring this final tank to life. He never saw the incoming shell, never heard the distinctive whistle that experienced soldiers recognized as a warning. One moment he was running toward the disabled tank, the next the world disappeared in a flash of blinding light and concussive force that seemed to turn his bones to liquid. The explosion lifted him off his feet, tossed him like a rag doll through air suddenly thick with soil, snow, and shrapnel. He felt impacts across his body, 1,000 burning needles driving deep into flesh, his mouth filled with the copper taste of blood. He tried to blink to clear his vision, but the darkness remained absolute. A high-pitched whine filled his ears, drowning out all other sounds. As Wright dragged Jacob toward a foxhole, a German shell landed 30 yards away. The explosion sent them both sprawling. Wright was unharmed, but Jacob lay motionless, blood streaming from a dozen wounds where shell fragments had torn through his body. "Medic!" Wright screamed, applying pressure to the worst of Jacob's wounds. "I need a medic here!" The world faded in and out for Jacob. Moments of searing clarity, punctuated by merciful darkness. He could feel hands on him, urgent voices that seemed to come from very far away. Someone was cutting away his clothing, applying pressure bandages, injecting morphine into his thigh. The pain receded to a dull throb, but the darkness remained. "My eyes," he tried to say, but wasn't sure if the words actually left his mouth. "I can't see." "Don't try to talk," a voice said close to his ear. "We're getting you out of here. You've done enough, son, more than enough." As consciousness slipped away, Jacob's last coherent thought wasn't of his wounds or his blindness. It was of the 20th tank, still sitting silently in the snow, and the 5 men whose faces he would never see again. The battalion surgeon, Captain Howard Mills, treated Jacob in a makeshift aid station just behind the lines. The medical tent was overflowing with wounded, men with frozen limbs, shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, and the 1,000 other injuries that modern warfare inflicted on human bodies. The air reeked of antiseptic, blood, and fear. Mills worked quickly, removing the most accessible shell fragments, cleaning and bandaging the wounds. But the damage to Jacob's face and eyes concerned him most. Multiple fragment wounds to the torso and face, his report stated. Severe damage to both eyes. Prognosis for vision recovery extremely poor. "Will he see again?" Wright asked, hovering nearby, his uniform still stained with Jacob's blood. Mills shook his head slightly. "The fragments severed the optic nerves. There's nothing we can do about that. Not here, maybe not anywhere." Wright looked down at the unconscious form of the electrical specialist who had saved so many tanks, so many lives. "He needs to know it mattered." "What he did out there? It mattered. He's got a long road ahead," Mills replied, already turning to the next wounded soldier. "If he survives the evacuation." The journey from the front lines to the field hospital at Libramont was a nightmare of jolting ambulances on icy roads, the constant pain of wounds with inadequate medication, and the terrifying darkness that didn't lift even when Jacob regained consciousness. Other wounded men moaned and screamed around him. The ambulance stopped twice to remove bodies of those who didn't survive the journey. At the field hospital, Jacob underwent more extensive surgery. A neurosurgeon confirmed what Mills had already determined. The optic nerve damage was irreversible. "We can save the eyes themselves," he told Jacob when he awoke, "but they won't function again. I'm sorry, son." Jacob tried to process this information through the haze of pain and medication. 23 years old, and he would never see another sunrise. Never see his mother's face when he returned home. Never see his future wife, his children, a world at peace. He tried to form a question, but his parched throat produced only a raspy whisper. "The tanks," he managed finally. "Did they hold?" The surgeon, accustomed to the priorities of soldiers, understood. "Last we heard, Bastogne was still in American hands. That's all I know." Jacob was evacuated to England, and from there to a specialized hospital for the war-blinded in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The darkness became his constant companion, more intimate than any friend or lover could be. He learned to navigate it, to make peace with it, though the nightmares persisted, dreams of light and color that faded upon waking to the reality of permanent night. In the critical days that followed his evacuation, the Sherman tanks Jacob had repaired played a vital role in defending Bastogne until Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the besieged forces on December 26th. The American lines bent but never broke. The German offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble, eventually ran out of fuel and momentum, ground down by the stubborn defense of places like Bastogne. Of the 177 tanks that ultimately received Jacob's modifications, 168 remained operational throughout the battle. an unprecedented 95% readiness rate in such extreme conditions. Those Shermans destroyed or disabled dozens of German tanks and armored vehicles, helped hold critical road junctions, and provided essential fire support for the surrounded infantry. Colonel Harwick, visiting Jacob in the hospital before his evacuation to England, brought an unofficial count. Your tanks knocked out 17 Panthers, 23 Panzer IVs, and held a perimeter that by all rights should have collapsed. 200 tank crewmen made it because of you. Jacob, his eyes bandaged, couldn't see the colonel's face.
The modifications were against regulations, sir. To hell with regulations, Harwick replied. You saved Bastogne. Some tank commanders were more specific in their gratitude. Lieutenant Harris, whose Sherman was the first Jacob had repaired near the front, sent a letter that a nurse read aloud to Jacob in the hospital. My crew and I fired 63 rounds at the enemy after you got us running again. We knocked out 2 Panzer IVs and a self-propelled gun that was hammering our infantry. That's at least 20 German soldiers who won't be fighting anymore, and God knows how many of our boys who didn't get hit because of it. There's no way to calculate what you did for us, but I want you to know it mattered. But the official report told a different story. Jacob's modifications, while effective, had indeed violated every safety protocol in the book.
The investigation concluded that while his actions had been valuable during the emergency, they could not be officially recognized or commended without undermining the very regulations designed to protect tank crews. The aftermath was a study in contradictions. Tank commanders and crews credited Jacob with saving their lives. Military engineers studied his modifications, many of which were later incorporated into improved electrical systems on subsequent Sherman variants. But officially, Jacob Winters had broken the rules. His actions were recorded as unauthorized field expedient repairs during extreme combat conditions. No medals, no commendations, no official recognition. And the final cost became clear once Jacob was transferred to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington. The shell fragments had destroyed his optic nerves. He would never see again. Major Reynolds visited him there in February 1945. The men took up a collection, he said, pressing something into Jacob's hand. It was a small metal object, a miniature Sherman tank made from spent shell casings by the tankers he'd saved. Engraved on the bottom were the words, "To the man who gave us light." Jacob's fingers traced the model tank, feeling each detail. "Did it matter, sir, in the end?" "The Germans never took Bastogne," Reynolds said simply. "Without your tanks, I don't know if we could say the same." After the war, Jacob returned to Pennsylvania. He learned to navigate the world without sight, to use his hands, still skilled, still precise, in new ways. He married, had a daughter, lived quietly. The nightmares came often. Explosions, the smell of burning wire, the desperation of working against time while men's lives hung in the balance. The Army never officially recognized his contribution. The modified tanks were returned to standard specifications as soon as the crisis passed. Engineering reports detailing his innovations were classified, then archived, then largely forgotten as newer tank models replaced the Sherman. In 1973, a group of veterans from the 7th Armored Division began petitioning the Army to recognize Jacob's contribution. Affidavits were collected from tank commanders and crew members who swore that they owed their lives to his unorthodox modifications. The official response was polite but firm. The modifications had been unauthorized and potentially dangerous. While the emergency of the situation was acknowledged, formal recognition was deemed inappropriate. "They can't admit I was right," Jacob told his daughter, "because then they'd have to admit their procedures were wrong." The small model tank sat on Jacob's mantle for 29 years. His fingers still traced it occasionally, remembering the feel of cold metal under artillery fire, the desperate race to keep tanks in the fight while the Battle of the Bulge hung in the balance. The Army's final decision arrived 3 days after Jacob's interview with the Veterans Recognition Committee. It stated, "While Specialist Winters' actions demonstrated commendable initiative under combat conditions, they represented significant deviations from established safety protocols that could have resulted in catastrophic equipment failure and loss of life. As such, formal decoration would send an inappropriate message regarding adherence to technical regulations during combat operations. Sarah read the letter aloud to her father. Jacob sat silently for a long moment after she finished. "Dad?" she finally asked. "What are you thinking?" Jacob's unseeing eyes remained fixed on that invisible point only he could sense. His fingers found the small model tank on the side table, tracing its familiar shape one more time. "I'm thinking about those boys in the tanks," he said quietly. 200 men who made it home, who had families, children.
Grandchildren. His voice grew firm. "I'd make the same choice again, even knowing." The dark was absolute. But in Jacob's mind, he could still see the Shermans rolling forward through the snow, guns blazing, holding the line at Bastogne. Still feel the cold metal against his bleeding fingers as he worked frantically to keep them in the fight. Still hear the tank commanders thanking him as their engines roared back to life. No medal could capture that. No official recognition could match the simple words engraved on the model tank, "To the man who gave us light." In the official history books, the Battle of the Bulge was won by generals and strategies, by the courage of ordinary soldiers and the overwhelming industrial might of America. Jacob Winters remains a footnote, if mentioned at all, the electrical specialist who broke the rules.
But in the memories of tank crews who survived those desperate days, who beat back the last great German offensive of the war, he remains something else entirely. The man who kept them in the fight when failure seemed certain. The man who saved them all and never saved himself. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to consider the quiet heroes whose names rarely appear in history books, those whose sacrifices continue to ripple outward through generations, even when official recognition never comes. Sometimes, the most profound impact is measured not in medals, but in the lives that continued because of a single person's choice to do the impossible.